Hello and welcome to the seventh episode of Arouca Press's Signposts podcast. I'm Julian Kwasniewski, Assistant Editor and Marketing Director at Arouca Press. Today I'm happy to be hosting Sir John Paul Sonnen, theologian, historian, and travel guide. I'm excited to be speaking with him today about his beautiful book from Arouca on the Renaissance Church of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre in Rome, St Onofrio al Giancolo. Sir John Paul, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
First off, before we dive into this book, I was wondering, could you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you've ended up as a historian, travel guide, theologian?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am one of six kids. I grew up in a devout Catholic family in the Twin Cities. You'll probably hear my very strong Minnesota accent. But I got my start in religious tourism when I moved to Italy to go to graduate school. So I attended the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. And at the time, they had a new program, a new major, and it was called Catholic Studies. And I had never heard anything like that in my life. So I looked into that major, and then I declared that as my major. And that's kind of what led me to Rome, because that was an interdisciplinary program which incorporated music and poetry and literature and history and philosophy and theology and all of these great, beautiful things, the institutions of the church, the religious orders, our different stages of history and theological development, and all of this great stuff in Catholic studies. So having that as a major really was a big part of my formation, and that's what led me to Rome in large part. So I began going to Rome as a young man. I was 19 years old the first time I entered the Eternal City, and it was a pivotal moment in my life, and it is for everyone. You know, it makes me think of Cardinal Ratzinger. Once I was at a talk he was giving, and somebody asked him, "When was the first time you went to Rome? What did it mean to you?" And he said, "Well, I was an older man. I was an older priest." And he said it was Holy Week 1962 was the first time I went to Rome, Italy. And he said that was a transformative experience that changed my life forever, and so on and so forth. So I can relate, as we all can. Rome has a powerful effect on all of us. We joke it's a bit like a drug. You take that drug, there's no turning back. But when I went to Rome the first time, I was led to this very interesting church, St Onofrio, which was kind of old and dilapidated and dark and kind of falling apart. But I fell in love with that church, and it's remained my favorite church. And everybody has their favorite church in Rome, and it's a city of churches, and there's over 450 churches in Rome. So there are churches in every street corner, and it's just a wonderful thing to get to know Rome. It's a great pleasure to live there, to study there. And so San Onofrio was my love from the very beginning, and that's what led me eventually to write this book.
Nice. And can you speak a little bit about the origins of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre? What is their work today? How did you become a member, and what does it mean for you?
Yeah, so the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem is basically a large global charity. It's a chivalric order of the church, one of only a couple, a bit like the Knights of St. John. It dates essentially kind of sort of back to the end of the First Crusade in about 1099 AD. We don't know the exact origins of the order, but it goes back, it traces its lineage back to Sir Godfrey of Boulogne, who was kind of the first general of Jerusalem. He was the liberator of Jerusalem with the First Crusade. He was the one who put together the framework of peace, a juridical framework to protect the Holy Land, to protect Jerusalem with knights and military orders. But he died early on, but the knights have lived on. And so the knights have a special charism to help defend and protect the Christians in the Holy Land. So as you know, and as most people should know, the Christian population in the Holy Land has really dwindled. Most of the Christians have left for various reasons, but it's become impossible for many of them to remain. So the Equestrian Order is this global charity under the auspices of the Holy See. There's about 30,000 members worldwide. Most of them are now American. It's kind of a couples thing. It's a lot of kind of husbands and wives, but we collect money, and then we give money to support the Latin Patriarchate, which is the Latin Rite ordinary there in kind of the Diocese of Jerusalem. So the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. So it's a massive operation. They have many schools. We support over 20,000 kids in those schools, and so the headquarters of the order is really in Jerusalem, but they also have headquarters in Rome, in the Palazzo della Rovere, which is a beautiful 15th century palace in the Via della Conciliazione, right across the street from the Vatican, but yet it's still part of Vatican City. It's extraterritorial property. And then up the hill from there, on the Gianicolo Hill, is this beautiful church of St Onofrio, which is the subject of my book. And that church is the official church in Rome under the auspices of the order. So it's operated by the order. It's under their possession. They own it, and they have some of their events there, but not many because it's quite small. So most of the events of the order in Rome were held at the Lateran Archbasilica, but San Onofrio remains our home. So it's a home for members of the order who are on pilgrimage, Videre Petrum. They come to Rome to see Peter, to see the tomb of St. Peter in the Vatican and all that. And then they're always encouraged to make their way up the Gianicolo Hill to visit this wonderful, beautiful church. So to be a member of the order is a great honor. My wife and I entered in Canada. It's a great pleasure, and I always feel unworthy to be a member, but it's being a member is a big part of me and what I do with my lifelong ministry of religious tourism. So at the age of 24, I got into faith-based tourism, religious tours, pilgrimages to Rome, to the Holy Land. So it's a huge part of who I am and what I do. And it's really it's our ministry, it's our calling. It's really an apostolate, as we would describe it.
Yeah. And so the subtitle of your book is Journeying to a Citadel of Faith. So is essentially the idea behind it, on the one hand, to make it more well known and just to tell something of its story and share something of its beauty with those who can't make it to Rome, and on the other hand, kind of to make a guidebook for it? Is that kind of your goal with the book?
Right. So the goal of the book, it's really an invitation to conversion, an invitation to pilgrimage. So we live in an age of travel where kind of everybody has been to Rome more than once. Everybody's kind of lived in different countries. Everybody's been to Europe, and everybody's just kind of always on the road, always in giro, as they say in Italian. So the aim of the book is really to kind of light a match to inspire people with the spirit of pilgrimage. And in doing that, we hope that they will have an interest in going to Rome, spending time in Rome, getting some sense of the art and architecture and history and what's going on. And then we hope they'll read the book and bring it with them when they go to visit this church. So section 4 has a self-guided tour, which is a part of the book. So the idea is that the people will read the book ahead of time, maybe review it on the airplane or whatever, and the flight over, and then carry it with them up the hill to the church. The church is only open in the morning, so we tell everybody, go there in the morning, make time on a weekday, and then maybe you go at 10 a.m., you'll have a couple hours there. There's usually nobody there. It's really kind of a forgotten church. It's off the beaten path. It's just kind of there. People walk by it. Not everybody even knows it's a church. There's a massive hospital next door, the Gesù Bambino. It's the pediatric children's hospital where all the babies are born of all the Vatican employees. There's a lot of activity in that neighborhood, but the church is kind of really a forgotten gem in Rome. But so the book, we hope people will be inspired to visit Rome, and one of the theological ideas kind of that I bring to shape in the book is that beauty is kind of the goal of pilgrimage. So beauty as defined as a theological category. We talk about the transcendentals, we talk about the good, the true, the beautiful, and Plato and all of that stuff. But really, a forgotten element, I think, for a lot of people in pilgrimage is that encounter with beauty, because we know that we live in a society of ugliness, and the ugliness is the left tells us ugliness is a virtue, that fear is a virtue, but the darkness is a virtue, but it's not, right? So the truth is the exact opposite. And we know the devil is a counterfeiter. So we don't believe anything the devil tells us, but but this beauty is important, and everybody talks about beauty when they go to a place like Florence or Rome, or it's that encounter with beauty. It's everywhere, and it's the Renaissance culture, with the good Renaissance culture, which is what we're talking about here. That beauty is not just art and architecture. It's so much more. It is literature. It is poetry. It is, the Mendicant orders, all these beautiful, Renaissance Madonnas and all this beautiful art. And having been a tour guide in the Vatican, I lived it. It was a big part of my life. The Raphael rooms and Sistine Chapel, and the Apostolic Palace and the loggias there. And when you're there every day, when you work there, when that's kind of your office, and you're showing that to people every day, it transforms you, and you kind of develop kind of a sense of ownership with it, where it's you really realize it's a universal patrimony, that it's a communis patria, that all of that beauty, all of that art, it belongs to all of us. It's part of a universal inheritance that we all share.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Renaissance there. I mean, the current Church of San Onofrio is a product of the Italian Renaissance. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the Renaissance and the various currents within it, right? Which in many ways seem contradictory. You have the luscious and sensuous secular humanism, burgeoning, but contrasting with the puritanical or semi-Manichaean Protestantism, um, of the Reformation in some areas, and on the other hand, a rebirth of the arts and philosophy in the service of the Catholic faith and the Counter-Reformation. I had these different contradictory things. Uh, I wonder if you can speak a bit to that
Yeah, absolutely.
that sort of muddle, you know?
Absolutely. Muddle is a good word to describe it. Yeah, the Renaissance was indeed a muddle. So there's a lot going on there. And depending on who you talk to, the Renaissance began kind of sort of around the year 1300. So a lot of people are going to tell you it started around 1400 AD, but really kind of 100 years before, we see all through the 14th century kind of leading up. And then the High Renaissance, and we have the 1400s, 15th century, and 16th century. And so really a period of over 200 years, and maybe even 300 years, as we mentioned, kind of depending on how you look at it. So that's a big chunk of time. There's a lot going on. That's the first time the world has kind of seen itself coming into a state of modernity, of being modern. It's kind of the end of the Middle Ages, 1,000 years. Just imagine a period of 1,000 years of beauty and Catholic culture and growth. And we think of the age of cathedrals in France 1,000 years ago, and Chartres Cathedral, and all this stuff going on in Europe. And then the devil always has a way of getting in. So with the Renaissance, there's all these new secular currents and this new spirit of humanism, and kind of spirits of disobedience too. The whole Protestant Reformation was born during that time, kind of the High Renaissance and tail end of that. And so all of this stuff going on, but you can see that art speaks a language, and the church recognizes that, and the church is the first patron of arts. And the popes knew the value in all of the art and the beauty, so they sought to harness that and Christianize it. And they did a great job. When you look at through the munificence of the papacy and the Holy See, and in the papal states, you just see a flowering of beauty. And they're going back to the classical elements. They're going back to the source documents, Vitruvius, and all the classical elements of architecture that speak of objective values of beauty. And that's really important. And these classical forms, which are immemorial, which have lasted to this very day. So for that reason, when you're in Florence, where the Renaissance was born, or the Capitoline Hill, or it was born in Rome, or any of these churches, or even schools, all these different interesting public buildings in Rome. And Rome is very much of a Baroque city, but there's still little elements, that you see here and there from the Renaissance, like this church. And when you just look at it, even from the outside, you need only stand there in front of it and study the outer loggia, and you just see the beauty of the symmetry and the balance, and the precision, and all of this mirrors the divine. It all mirrors God, and all of these churches, they're all built in such a way that it draws the eyes and the heart up, up to the heavens. We see these vertical structures, right? So there's kind of there's a lot of messaging going on. Some of it's, kind of subliminal, and it's very poetic, and it brings to mind Newman's quotes on imagination, the value of having an imagination, the value of
Mm.
cultivating an imagination, because really Catholics have the biggest imaginations of anyone, and maybe, so others too, right? High Church Anglicans, but we have these beautiful choirs and solemn liturgies where the music just soars into the vaults of these cathedrals, and we have these beautiful bell towers and steeples and just and the richness of song and poetry and liturgy and vestments and all of these magnificent things. So the Renaissance, very, very interesting time, but also you see the church making great strides too as it comes into the age of modernity, and there's all these kind of voices that appear, right? And then of course we know what all of that kind of rolled into with the Reformation, and then unfortunately the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. It's all been kind of downhill the past 500 years. But that being said, when we look at the glory of the Middle Ages, 13th century Europe, and it's been a long, long journey for the church, but it's so important that the papacy, the church, has always understood the importance of beauty and catering to people's five senses. There's no religion on the planet that caters to the five senses like the Catholic Church. And I think it was Aristotle who said all knowledge comes through the senses. So, we've got sight, sound, incense, we've got music, we've got all the visuals, we've got touch. It's just so catering to the essence of man. I think that's really important, and but in an eternal kind of way where it speaks of the eternity of God. It's timeless and classical, and so because of that, it's always new and always refreshing. And therein lies kind of the reward of the pilgrim, because the pilgrim journeys to Santiago de Compostela or Jerusalem or Chartres Cathedral or Rome or wherever, and you have the arrival of the pilgrim, and it's really that encounter with beauty and greatness. So even though there's all these different forces always at work to destroy the church and to destroy man, it's really the light of the church which illumines us, which illumines our hearts. And pilgrimage is a metaphor for life. We're all on a journey to God. We're all on a journey to heaven. We're all at a different place on that journey. We're all on the same road, we hope, going in the same direction. But there's always the light at the end of the tunnel, and that is the encounter with Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. And then digging, digging deeper or more specifically, I wonder if you could say something about the history of San Onofrio, in particular, and who was San Onofrio?
Yeah, so St Onofrio was a monk, and he was a Cenobitic monk who was born in about 320. We don't know exactly. Died in about the year 400, but he was an Egyptian. He lived in Upper Egypt, and that area had been the edge of the Roman Empire. So there was a lot of crazy stuff going on there on those outer edges. But this is long before the advent of Islam. So when we think of Egypt at that time, we think of it really as the cradle of Christianity. It was a very Christian area. You had Christian churches being built everywhere in the monastic tradition, monasteries with abbots and monks living under rules and abbots. But at the same time, at that time, you still had pagan shrines there. You still had pagan temples. So you'd have pagan shrine here, and then across the way, across the stream or whatever, a Christian shrine being built. So very, very interesting. And Christ, the Holy Family, they spent, I think, 2.5 years around there in Egypt. So as they traveled, different shrines were built. And so when we speak of Egypt at that time, it had a very strong Christian culture. And so that's where monasticism was born, Christian monasticism as we know it today. So the first monks were there, and he was part of that first generation of monks. So I said he was Cenobitic, which means he was member of a community, but the way they structured things in those days were, if you were a member of a community under an abbot, and if you had been there a long time and you had the disposition to be a monk, and you were very advanced in the spiritual life, and if you had the disposition to be a hermit, you could receive special permission from your abbot under his authority to go into the desert and live as a hermit. Now, Most of the monks who did that, it was a one-way ticket. When they went into the Egyptian desert, they didn't come back. So they went to live there, to die there. They would live alone. They would live in caves. It was kind of the ultimate form of the expression of monastic life for them. So he was part of that first wave of monks there in Egypt, and then he was part of the first wave into the desert. Now, the Egyptian Christians, the Copts, have had great devotion to St Onofrio for all these hundreds of years. So they're the ones who have preserved his memory, his story, but also in the Latin Church. So even though most people have not heard of St Onofrio, he's actually mentioned in the Roman Martyrology. In June 13th is the day he died, is the day he was born, as it says. So he's mentioned that day, even though he was not a martyr. But his incredible story was recorded by an abbot named the Abbot Pamnuncius, and the whole narrative of the story is included in my book, and it's really very interesting. So the Abbot Pamnuncius went into the wilds of the Egyptian desert to be inspired and to meet some of these hermits, and he was led to St Onofrio, and he meets him, and they eat together, and they pray together, and they keep vigil all night. It's an extraordinary story as you're reading this ancient narration, really from the 4th century A.D. And then in the morning, St Onofrio, he dies. So it's kind of an unusual thing. So they just met, and then they're kind of hanging out together all night, and then the next morning, he announces he's going to die. He dies, and then he's buried there by the abbot. And then the abbot goes back to civilization, back to the monastery, and writes about his incredible encounter with Onofrios, St Onofrio, which Onofrios in English we say. And so the Egyptians have great devotion to him. If you visit Egyptian churches and I don't know, places like Chicago or New York or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, you're going to see maybe icons dedicated in his memory or a stained glass window. You can always recognize St Onofrio because he's got a long beard and he looks like a hermit. His clothes are all kind of tattered and kind of fallen away, and he looks like just a guy in the wilderness living in a cave. So that his memory has been preserved in the Christian East and the Christian West. He is a legitimate saint. We know he existed. There's a historical record. We have a cultus devoted to him. We have stories of miracles and all of this and that. So he's revered in some parts of like Portugal and southern Italy and Sicily. There's just different kind of Byzantine communities. But I always encourage people, have a devotion to St Onofrio, get to know him, just a wonderful saint. And so this church in Rome dedicated in his memory was built by a couple guys who were Franciscans, but they wanted to be hermits. So they started their own order. And so they did that. They got permission from the Holy See. They wanted to be in Rome, which was the heart of Christianity. So the Pope gave them land at the beginning of the 15th century on the Gianicolo Hill because there was nobody up there. It was just forest. There was an oak grove forest there. There was a little goat trail, like a little ox cart trail that went up the side of the Gianicolo Hill that dated back to Roman times. So it's still there to this day, that road. But anyhow, so that's how the monks got up there. And then they lived in shacks they built in the woods there. And then in about kind of 1419, they were able to build their monastery. And then by the 1490s, they were building their church there. And all of these structures are still there to this day. And the founder, Nicola da Forca Palena, he's buried there. And so there's long history there, but that order, the Geronimites, they died out, unfortunately, and then they were finally suppressed for lack of vocations in 1933. And they just, what really did them in was there was a lot of problems in the 19th century, the revolutions on the European continent, as all these Catholic kind of monarchies and governments were all being overthrown. And the same thing happened in Italy with the Risorgimento. And so in 1870, Garibaldi and his people came in and they took St Onofrio, they took the monastery, they took the church, and so the monks had no home. They lacked that critical mass of monks to continue, and so they died out. So when they were suppressed by Pius XI, the Church of St Onofrio was just kind of an orphan. But then, by God's grace, Pope Pius XII in 1945 gave that church, St Onofrio, to the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem, making it their de facto official chapel in Rome. So it's a long and interesting history. St Onofrio, and a lot of different people go there on pilgrimage. You'll see some Egyptians. There is a community, a large, quite frankly, a large community of Egyptian Orthodox Christians who live in Rome, who have immigrated, who have left Egypt, and many of them they live in the suburbs of Rome, but they'll come in and they'll visit the church and pray there, and so all sorts of different pilgrims of all different backgrounds make their journey there, and it all adds to the rich fabric of the experience.
Hmm. And so speaking of people buried there, Torquato Tasso, the poet, is also buried there, and you speak about him in your book. Who is he, and how is he connected with this church?
Yeah, so Torquato Tasso is a really interesting character. He is called the greatest bard of the Renaissance. So by that we mean the greatest poet. And a couple hundred years, a few hundred years after Dante, and he dies in 1595 in his 50s. And very interesting character, though. He very gifted poet, very tortured soul. He had probably what we would call today like bipolar disorder, and he was racked by depression and all sorts of just problems, health problems. And so anyhow, he became famous when he wrote a poem called Jerusalem Delivered. And it's a poem, but it's actually a book. I've got a copy of it here. This is the Whiffen edition. So even though it's a poem, it's very, very long. The audio book I think is like something like 12 hours. But anyhow, the whole story of Jerusalem Delivered is it's the story of the delivery of Rome, or not of Rome, rather of Jerusalem, the liberation of Jerusalem during the First Crusade. But it's a made up story. So there's certain historical elements, but it's a fictional work. There's all these different fantasias and kind of fantasies, and it's very interesting, right? And so it's been greatly embellished by Tasso, but it's a very interesting storyline. Very gripping account of kind of the whole leading up to the battle, and all these different characters and the knights and ladies, and so that poem became immensely famous. It was kind of the most famous poem in the West at that time. So everyone knew it. They knew the characters, and became a big part of the culture way up even until the 19th century. So people 100 years ago, they knew about Tasso, they knew about his poetry. Now, today, nobody's heard of him. I remember I was in Malta with my old professor of art history. He was 90 years old, and we were chit-chatting. I asked him what he thought about Tasso, and he said, I never cared for that guy, never understood his poetry. He said, my grandfather read Tasso when I was a boy in the 1930s. This is my professor. He was born in, I think, 1929. So he said, when I was a kid, my grandfather was still reading those old Tasso books, but he said, I never had any time for any of that. So to each his own. It is a different kind of poetry. It is different. It's unique. It's not everybody's cup of tea. When we read it in English, it's a 19th century translation. So you're going to lose a lot in the translation. But many Italian students still read Tasso when they study Renaissance culture and history. Tasso is a big part of it. So in the Liceo, a lot of Italian kids develop kind of a love for Tasso and his poetry, and you'll see a lot of student groups visiting San Onofrio Church in Rome. So they'll pull up in their bus, and the kids jump out, and they've all got their notebooks and their Tasso, but Italians, they appreciate these things, right? So it's not like if you were trying to force American kids in the public high school to read Tasso, it's a part of their spirit. It's so much a part of them, and they're kind of programmed. The Italians are very sentimental people, but kind of programmed to really appreciate and love and understand the poetry. So they go there to the church because Tasso is buried there, and he's buried there because he died there. And the reason he died there is he, at the end of his life, was kind of homeless. He was just racked with all of these mental issues. He had been locked away in Ferrara, in an insane asylum, and just all these personal struggles. Well, the monks took him in, and he went there because the air was believed to be better there because it's on top of the hill. So you have the seven hills of Rome, and then you have the Tiber River, Then you have the Gianicolo Hill, which is outside of Rome proper. It's on the west side of that river, and but it's very high. So there's a microclimate there because they get wind off the Tyrrhenian, off the Mediterranean Sea. So for that reason, to this day, on a real hot summer day in Rome on August, smart people will go up to the top of the Gianicolo Hill or take the Vatican Gardens tour. You're on top of the Vatican Hill, or you actually feel a breeze. It's actually cooler up there. So they believe for his lungs and for breathing, it would be better for him to live there. And then he died. He just died. So whatever he died of, it was a terrible tragedy. He was young. But he died the same year St. Philip Neri died. So for that reason, I kind of have a theory that they knew each other, because Philip Neri always came to San Onofrio. He loved San Onofrio and led his groups up there in the summer times, summer months, to lead all his events with evangelizing young people. And because in those days San Onofrio had all this acreage, all these groves, these vineyards, and all of that was destroyed and taken out at the end of the 19th century during the reunification of Italy, when they came in and brought architects and engineers from Paris and elsewhere, and they built kind of a new structure of roads and parks and everything in Rome to make it look like a real European capital. So they destroyed all of the property of San Onofrio, and they destroyed all these buildings to build the hospital there. And it's so it's quite sad, but in any event, the church has survived, and his tomb is there. And Tasso was originally buried in the sanctuary, but they exhumed him in the 19th century, and they put him in a brand new, beautiful 19th century tomb designed by Canova in the back of the church in a side chapel. That's quite beautiful, quite fitting. And so the students go in there, and they'll have their little notebooks, and they'll read, Jerusalem Delivered, the opening canto, and you'll see them, and reciting the poetry. So it's quite nice to see, that culture surviving, that level of creativity and imagination. And so Tasso, very interesting man, very tortured soul, very gifted storyteller and author. And I wish he was more well known in the U.S. Hopefully in maybe some homeschool circles, there's some hope where kids can kind of learn a little bit about his poetry and about Jerusalem Delivered, which is really a tremendous work of art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you've already mentioned this a few times, but in your book, especially in the introduction and conclusion, I think you speak about the universal appeal of art and beauty. And this was a theme beloved to Pope Benedict, who said in the Ratzinger report that the only really effective apologia for Christianity comes down to two arguments: the saints the church has produced and the art which has grown in her womb. He says that in the Ratzinger report. And it seems like San Onofrio, the church, is such an excellent example of this, with saints associated with it and great art associated with it. And I wonder if you could speak to this idea of the apostolate of beauty, the apostolate of the arts a little bit more, and how your work as a tour guide, as a religious pilgrim guide, has confirmed this insight.
Yeah, so beauty is an important kind of tool for evangelization, because it's a channel to the soul, and it's a universal language, and kind of all people understand that language, we hope. But Pope Benedict, he had a lot of famous quotes. One of his quotes was that Christianity has never been tried. If it had been tried, the whole world would be Christian already. But the reality is Christianity has not been tried. It's not that it's failed. It's that it hasn't really been tried. So the world never really has really come into kind of a Christian census, as we would like, as we would hope. So a big part of our Christian life, and this was a big part of medieval theology and spirituality, and even kind of, medieval, the experience of going to confession. You would confess your sins, and the priest would say, well, make a pilgrimage to our local shrine or our local cathedral, or to Canterbury or to Walsingham, or wherever, right? So pilgrimage gives us an opportunity to encounter beauty, and it's a transformative experience. And it's just one of those things where there's so many different people in the world that have all of these different concepts of beauty, right? But it's the church that gives us these sort of eternal concepts of beauty, these eternal visions, like the dome of St. Peter's Basilica or the ceiling of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. These are works that are so grand. They're on such an incredible scale that most people will never see anything like it again. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity. Or when I lead groups to Jerusalem, when they enter Basilica, the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem, which is the holiest shrine in the world, it's a transformative experience to encounter this measure of beauty, this level of beauty. And it has to do with metanoia. So, and metanoia is a word we don't always hear. Some of the popes have kind of talked about it a little bit. Pope John Paul was frequently speaking of the experience of metanoia, and that's an important concept for people to keep on their radar, because that's kind of the whole essence of pilgrimage, is that you're having this encounter, a moment of conversion, metanoia. So there's a transformation that's taking place in your soul, and therein lies kind of the whole grace at work. So the grace of pilgrimage, it's a grace of conversion. There's many elements that contribute to it in pilgrimage, but it's really, I've always said, it's really that encounter with beauty, that transformative experience. And as Cardinal Ratzinger mentioned, as you mentioned, it's the church is such a witness to the nations with this beauty, the beauty of our art, but also the beauty of the saints we produce, because no religion in the world has produced the saints and the art we have produced. And that's really important to realize. And we think of these monks, these early hermits, they were the real thing. Not all monks are the real thing today. I hate to single out any religion or group, but I think of like Buddhist monks. They don't really take perpetual vows. When we speak of the Benedictine tradition, and when we speak of monasticism in the West, these are people, men and women, taking perpetual vows that they are bound by until death, and they renounce the world. And then there's great merit in that, and great inspiration, and so many spiritual fruits. And so at St Onofrio, it's a place of prayer, a place of long time prayer and very intense prayer, and a very unique call to be a hermit. Benedict talks about this in his rule, and the rule of Saint Benedict. And it's just something that's been lost. So it's there's so many things that have been lost in the modern era, but we just hope that we can brick by brick just save as many people as we can, and give them this experience, this encounter of metanoia, of beauty, and beauty as a theological concept, right? As part of the life of God, the sacramental life of the church, where we all become co-heirs, right? With Christ and the mystical body. And it's a wonderful, wonderful theology, the mystici corporis, and so there's really so much going on. But we always encourage people, come on our pilgrimages, come to Rome, come to Jerusalem. You're going to see and encounter beauty in the art and the people, and even the dynamic of group travel, group pilgrimages. So in the Middle Ages, people didn't usually travel alone on pilgrimage. We might imagine a guy with a walking stick and a big pack around his back, but it was too dangerous. People, they traveled in groups, and there's a whole dynamic because you don't travel alone. You're walking in the footsteps of Jesus Christ, but you're walking together as a community. And even though it's kind of a cliche to say this, it's really true that, with all this beauty and greatness of all these shrines and churches, it's really the people that are the living stones of the church. The church structures are living structures, but, the church's tradition is a living tradition, and we, the baptized, we are the living stones, right, on a journey to perfection, we hope, with our final aim being heaven.
Sure. And you mentioned Jerusalem. Obviously, Jerusalem and Rome are such different places. But how's your time in Jerusalem and the Middle East differed from that in Italy and Rome, and given you sort of different insights into the faith and this sort of theology of pilgrimage and beauty?
Yeah, so I always tell people, people they'll ask me, they'll say, well, you've been to all these, churches and shrines all over the world, and what's your favorite place? What's your favorite destination? I tell everybody hands down it's the Holy Land. So a great part of my ministry, my life calling with religious tourism has been to promote tours to the Holy Land, pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Um, a lot of people they wait their whole lives, they wait till it's too late. Um, so I encourage people, get to the Holy Land. It's the holiest place in the world, the holiest shrine in all of Christendom, in the whole Christian world. It's not St. Peter's Basilica. It's not the Sistine Chapel. It's not Fatima. It's not Lourdes. It's the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And the Holy Sepulchre is the empty tomb of Jesus Christ. And when you go there, you enter that empty tomb. You see that it's empty. And then you go back as an ambassador of Jesus Christ. You go back to whatever part of the world you came from, and therein lies your witness. Your story is you can say, I was there. I saw the tomb. It is empty. He is risen. So that's the key message of Christianity. And you get all of that and more in Jerusalem, because there you're going back in time. There you're seeing where Jesus lived and walked. I think of all my times there, like swimming in the Sea of Galilee, or skiing in the north where there's snow, or walking around Bethlehem pre-dawn in the dark as you're going to the grotto and there's nobody there, or doing the Via Crucis in Jerusalem and the Via Dolorosa at 4:30 in the morning, and there's nobody out, and you're just going and praying, and or just visiting the empty tomb of Christ on Easter Sunday. Or I once had the privilege, I was in the grotto of Bethlehem at midnight mass, and that was an incredible experience. And that was my first time in the Holy Land in 2006. So I just encourage people, there's all these great places to visit. Rome is the New Jerusalem. Rome is wonderful. We've all been there. But really keep an open mind about the Holy Land, because the Holy Land is really where it's at. And I think a great victory for the devil has been to convince people that the Holy Land's not important, or that it's too dangerous to visit, because that has been a point for the evil one, keeping people away, and by different perceptions that we've been conditioned to receive through the media and other outlets which have formed our thinking, just telling us, stay away, right? Stay away from the Holy Land. But when you go there, you see it as the land of peace. You see it as the land of Jesus Christ, and you see that it has God's special blessing for peace. And each year there's about 5 million people that visit Jerusalem. So there's pilgrims from all over the world, and we learn from these other pilgrims. I have learned from the devotion and piety of these groups that come from countries like Ukraine and Poland and Russia and the Philippines, and just all of these wonderful nations and peoples that come together and meet there. And so for me, the Holy Land will always be number one.
Mm-hmm. And where can our listeners find out more about your trips?
So for our trips, I'm happy to say that we have a super awesome Holy Land tour that leaves just after American Thanksgiving this year, November 25th to December 6th. And your dad is our special guest, Dr. Peter K. And we are super excited about this tour. It is going to be a VIP experience. It's a traditional Catholic tour. It's once in a lifetime opportunity. We've got not one, but 2 priests going. We're going to have daily mass in the traditional rite, the classical rite. We've got some VIP extras there's a bonus extra day we've added on the last day, where Dr. Peter K. will give us a couple lectures, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. We're going to break for a leisurely lunch. We're going to have a special mass at the Latin Patriarchate, which is usually closed to the public. A beautiful 19th century chapel. So all of these wonderful opportunities. You can find more information at reginamagazine.org. That's reginamagazine.org. We have limited seating. So to avoid disappointment, please, if anyone is interested, contact me as soon as possible. Get your name in. I'll pencil you in. We've got a webinar coming up later in May. There's a link to that in our website, reginamagazine.org. Amazing, incredible experience. And actually, now that I think about it, Julian, I hope you will join us too.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll be able to, but that would certainly be a wonderful experience. Um,
Jerusalem calls you.
yeah,
Jerusalem mirabilis.
Jerusalem. Yeah. Uh, Now, as we wrap up here, I just wanted to ask you, you're a regular writer for Liturgical Arts Journal and some other sites. Are there any other projects, any other books in the works?
Yeah, so I've written kind of hundreds of articles online. So I'm kind of forming them into a couple of key books. One book is called The Global Pilgrim, and it'll have pilgrimage destinations from all over the world. Another is called In Pursuit of Beauty, and that book is going to have 30 key churches and shrines in the US that people should know about, that they should visit. And a lot of these are new and shrines and churches that many people have never heard of. I'll give you a few examples, like the TAC Chapel in Santa Paula, California. I think everybody should see that. The Fraternity of St. Peter Seminary in Denton, Nebraska. I think everybody should see that. So it's old and new, and it's not just kind of, big, beautiful churches you might think of, like, I don't know, the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., but it's traditional shrines. So I've got several traditional Latin Mass parishes that have really put their place on the map, and just where there's a lot of really interesting things going on in the area of liturgical arts and prayer, music and liturgy, and where Catholic culture is thriving. So those two are coming down the pipeline. We're looking forward to that. Those Catholic pilgrimages
Awesome.
based in Ohio. So if there's any pastors out there interested in leading authentic Catholic pilgrimages, be in touch with me. Let me know, and I'll organize the best possible tour for you. That's what we do. I'll leave my email address if I may. It's JSONNEN at stcharlespilgrimages.com. That's JSONNEN at stcharlespilgrimages.com.
Sir John Paul, thank you so much for sharing us all this with us. Um, uh, the book on St Onofrio is available on Arouca Press's website, and you can check the description below for links to that book and links to the Regina pilgrimage site. And thanks for listening to this episode. Please share and like it, and we'll see you next time at aroucapress.com.